My name is Adam Copeland. I'm the artistic director of the Flying Carpet Theater. And one of our missions is to use entertainment to spark conversation. And so part of when we do a show, we very much like to include talkback series, because it's an extension of what we do. And with that in mind, we often try and get experts on the themes in the show to help us talk back with the audience, hear a little bit about what you thought, and also get a chance to chat about some of the issues that were raised by the show. We are very privileged and honored tonight to have two world-class physicians with us who have both had long careers in public health, both in government, private industry, and in media. Dr. Rich Besser is the Chief Health and Medical Correspondent at ABC News, and also spent a long career in government. During the intermission, he and I were talking about his work in 2009 in the swine flu epidemic. And Dr. Derek Yock is the Senior Vice President of the Vitality Group and the Executive Director of the Vitality Institute for Health Promotion. He's also been in government, worked at the World Health Organization, and has the unusual distinction of reading Enemy of the People, the source material for this play, several times a year, which is pretty amazing for me and for us. So welcome to both of these gentlemen. And I will start off the way we typically do this. I'll start off with a question for them, and then we'll get a chance for you to chat with us, ask questions to the cast and crew who are here, and also ask questions of our experts. And as they come in, if questions are directed to any of us, we'll introduce ourselves, etc. So I will start with Dr. Yock and ask the question of what in the play would you say reminded you of some element in your own career, something analogous, and perhaps you could sort of talk about the parallel.
Thanks, Adam, and wonderful to be here. Really on stage like this. And I wish I had the capabilities that you all have. I actually think two things kept coming back to me through the play. The first is, as a South African, at the early stages of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, recording very clearly in the late 80s the data on the seroprevalence, or the level of HIV/AIDS infection rate, being extremely low, but we knew that it was inevitably going to rise. It was somewhere about 0.1, 0.2% in the population. And we knew from what was happening around the world and the projections that inevitably, if we didn't act then, we would see a smoldering, massive epidemic, which, as you know, happened. And we were unable to get the action at the point when it would have had the maximum impact. And that is obviously the permanent tragedy and challenge of public health. How on earth do you act when the body count is not visible and around you? And then on the other side, when it comes to the nature of different interventions, I spent a lot of time in tobacco control. And every time you introduce an intervention, the economic argument is raised. As you saw here, the economic livelihood of the town was at stake. And whether it was the very first experience we had of doing something really modest, banning smoking in restaurants in Cape Town, the response of the tobacco industry way back then was to withdraw money for the city orchestra. Really sort of a proportionate, sensible response. Then we got told that as you start banning advertising, you'd see the collapse of the advertising and the marketing industry as we knew it. Business would collapse and there'd be a massive decline in economic activity, which of course never happened. When you raised the levels of taxes, you were going to see employment move offshore, and you were going to see again the collapse of whole economies. People were going to be laid off, big job losses. Again, none of that ever happened. And I think both of those points really come through very strongly in the play. How you act early in the phase of an epidemic where the potential is greatest, and how you take actions where there are going to be economic interests at stake. And overcoming those economic interests for the long term require considerable political skill. One of the telling points in the play was when it was said very clearly that physicians know nothing about public policy. Of course, what they're really saying is physicians should be kept out of public policy because they always irritate and they always raise issues that are very uncomfortable and difficult to deal with.
Dr. Besser, I will throw the same question to you from your own career. And also, if things in your media experience struck you, that would be another area to talk about.
Yeah, so there are two things to touch on. One, I was having major flashbacks and was feeling very strong connection to Dr. Hill. So in 2009, when swine flu hit, I was the acting director of the Centers for Disease Control, and we were seeing hospitals in Mexico full of people. We were hearing of mortality rates that were extremely high, and we had just gotten the first cases identified in the United States. And so we didn't know how severe this was going to be and how extreme the actions would be. We had plans written up that included everything that Dr. Hill was talking about in terms of banning social gatherings, social distancing, closing schools, having school lunches delivered to children rather than children going to school to get their lunch. And we didn't know how aggressive to be. And I remember I had to make the case to the White House in terms of making decisions based on limited information. And in the play, not knowing how fast it would come to that community, hearing how devastating it could be to a community to not have this show arrive, but also knowing that if the flu arrived before the show, you could be killing a large part of the population. So that was really spot on, and all the pushback and those arguments that were being made were the real arguments that we were hearing. It's like, how can you recommend this happens when you don't know how severe this is going to be? But in public health, the case I made every day on the news was that when there's a new outbreak, when there's an emerging infection, you have to be incredibly aggressive because you may only have one chance to stop it from coming. And I made that case every day, and I think the ABC News liked the way I made it because they offered me a job after I left CDC. And so the other thing that I really connected with was the snake oil salesman and that whole thing. And I do.
It's an interesting duality.
Yeah, because that's something that I do a lot of reporting on. Just last week, I was reporting on an outbreak of hepatitis in Hawaii. 2 people with liver transplant, 1 person who died, 22 people who have liver failure because of a supplement that had some kind of contaminant in it. And the issue is that Congress has said that we will regulate supplements as food. And it's really, in my mind, modern day snake oils products. We don't know what we're taking, but someone will get up and sell it in a really, really convincing way that it will take care of your problems. And we want that message because we're not getting that from Western medicine all the time we want it.
5-hour Olympian.
Yeah. Let me turn it over to the audience, and please, if you want to share thoughts, throw questions to any of us, now is the time.
What would it take? I mean, swine flu didn't end up killing that many people, but what would it take to shut down all of the public gatherings? I mean, that seems so extreme. Would it take streets littered with bodies, or, I mean, how on earth you see in the play how hard it is to shut stuff down in a little teeny town. I don't see that anybody would ever be able to shut things down in a whole country or a state without, everybody keeling over.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question because around all those plans, every department in the federal government was supposed to be planning on what they would do if there was a shutdown. What would the Department of Transportation do to facilitate movement of goods? Would there be money available for people who get a daily wage so that they could stay home and take care of their kids rather than going to work? And those things weren't in place. But initially, we did a lot of our planning around the Spanish flu, and that was the worst case scenario. But biologically, the Spanish flu is not the worst case scenario. We could see a flu that's far worse than that. In the early days of swine flu, the mortality rate for Spanish flu is about 2%. But when the entire population is getting hit, 2% is a lot of people. Here with the swine flu, we were initially seeing 40%. With bird flu, it hasn't spread, that's about 60%. So theoretically, we could see something far worse, and it might lead to pushing for social distancing.
I think I saw at the start of the SARS epidemic when I was at WHO, and if you can remember then, they actually did close down international travel for a while. And the response here, if you may remember, was that, I think it was the then CDC director or the Secretary of Health, got on a plane and went to Canada in defiance of the ban to show that this was actually not a serious issue and that they were not going to take international norms and standards strongly. And so you do see that accepted international norms often go against, in that case, fears of trade and international travel were at risk. That was the big fear. But I think people in retrospect believe that the close down in international travel for a limited period may very well have held back the spread of SARS. The other thing related to the spread is that we think too quickly about infectious diseases as being the only threat that can spread very rapidly. And having spent more years in the last few years focusing on things like tobacco, obesity, diabetes, we're seeing their spread happening as fast or as dramatically and globally with more devastating effects than many infectious diseases ever had. Yet because they're happening in slow motion and they're happening as communicated rather than as communicable diseases, we're not taking the action that we would if it was happening in real fast time. If we could see somebody, the deaths from tobacco are piling up 20, 30, 40 years from now, but they are piling up. The deaths from type 2 diabetes, from obesity and diet and activity issues are piling up very fast and threatening economies, yet they're not getting the urgency that you'll get from something as acute and dramatic as an infectious disease.
One of the things I was thinking about, I can't remember the exact issue, but at one point it seemed like Dr. Egerton was actually more scientific in his kind of, there was like one thing that was like, oh, that actually is how it works. And so that made me think, well, you know, even the snake oil salesman might be close to the truth, but still not be necessarily on the side of public health. And then kind of in a similar vein, you know, in your play, the media were on the side of business. You know, there was a lot of pressure, but there's also, I feel like, a lot of pressure for the media to be on the side of medicine and science and social caution. You know, it's almost more natural, I feel like, in the 21st century for the media to be, you know, like to play up or fears, you know, pandemic fears or communicable fears. So I don't know. I feel like it's a hard problem. It's not like there's like a science way and a snake oil way.
I think one thing you're saying, which is very striking, you see that Dr. Egerton relied on his evidence was really required dressing up things in complicated, magnificent words and language that had a strong feeling of science, but was obviously purely pseudoscience. And I think that's often a clue in the nightly television ads that we watch, particularly probably after 11 o'clock at night, to what is just simply snake oil. But the other thing is that what was the quality of the evidence? And Richard and I come from a very boring discipline of epidemiology. And what they were relying on was testimonials or anecdote. And putting lots of anecdotes together sound very compelling in an audience when you hear about a real person who may very well have improved something they had improved. But that doesn't constitute evidence in the way we would actually go about deciding what truly works and what doesn't work. But they were able to play on that because there were real people behind it dressed up in a pseudoscience language.
I mean, one place where you see that almost exact language, I don't know if it was an inspiration, but if you look at athletes and these ion necklaces and bracelets that they wear for remagnetization, for balancing their fields. My son is 15 and plays baseball, a few years ago, his team with their outfit, they got the pants and the shirts and the shoes and their ion necklaces. And he was the one kid on the team who brought it back and said, well, my dad explained that this really isn't science. But they're, when you look at their website, they're loaded with testimonials of, I wore this necklace and I hit stronger than I was ever able to hit before. And maybe there's that effect that you believe it's going to work.
Be careful. So I've got Diana Nyad's extreme dream bracelet, which I believe in strongly and helps me.
You'll be able to swim further.
And I do swim further with it, actually. And this one is just made by my son. So.
Very much like Dumbo and the magic feather.
Yeah.
You need that to fly, and people really want to hold on to something tangible, which is kind of goes with the body counts. But a question for the doctors: what do you say to people that don't want to immunize their children?
I'm a pediatrician, and I still see children. What I used to say was, I think you need to find another pediatrician.
Right.
I don't say that anymore. Now I share information and hope that over time they'll come around, because I think as a pediatrician there's absolutely nothing that I do for children's health that has more proven value than vaccinating kids. But I also know that not everyone agrees with that, and there are other things that I can help parents and children with who decide not to vaccinate.
There was a wonderful piece in the play when you were speaking about, we'll just give them the choice. Just let people make the choice, and they will decide rationally. We know from behavioral economics, from Nobel Prize winners like Daniel Kahneman, that people don't make rational choices. Really rational predictability by Dan Ariely about individual behavior, or more closer to today, the irrational exuberance by Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics just this week. And what was he talking about? He was actually showing how markets also react irrationally. They always overvalue certain things and undervalue in the same ways we do in our individual behavior. We like to think that we are going to be able to make the best decision and choices, but in some issues like deciding on the balance of whether a vaccine is going to be good for you or not, I think making the choice limited through the way we actually go about putting vaccines in the closest possibility to parents and families, reducing any barrier to it, even giving incentives for people to have vaccines, whether it's in the case of children, which is done in some parts of the world, or in the case of flu vaccines for adults particularly. I think all help nudge, move, encourage, entice people to actually make a choice that's going to be in their best interest.
I just want to add a couple of things, two things actually. One has to do with the question of gullibility of the public, and I think we saw it enacted beautifully when they had the money and they could get the good stuff. That the doctor had been convincing everybody that if you drink the good milk, I'm speaking as a psychiatrist now, if you drink the good milk, you're going to be cured and you're going to be all right. And so I think the intensity with which people wish that they could take something in and that will make them all right is very powerful, and it's brought out by the play. I do also want to bring up another influenza type issue that we're currently dealing with, and that has to do with global warming. I think is the latest issue that the denial of that is so powerful that, and of course the fact that it's so far in the future, in quotes, that nobody wants to hear, and certainly the economic system is not at all interested in taking on this very real threat to not only just Georgia or the United States, but the entire world. So I just want to bring that in as well.
Just a comment on that, because I think that is also pervasive play here. We saw how how Dr. Egerton was encouraging the great sense of denial, persuading the man, working with the doctor. And I think the analogies, the first time I saw it most explicitly was with the tobacco industry. You can all remember, I hereby swear that tobacco is not addictive.
Yeah.
And within weeks, the tobacco industry documents that were forced into the public domain showed that they knew about the addictiveness way back in the 60s and were designing cigarettes to be nicotine delivery devices. That was their words of the industry. What we know about from the tobacco industry about the way they created denial as a strategy to sow doubt and therefore to keep the evidence away is exactly what we're seeing on some of the climate change debates. And it is a very carefully constructed effort by certain sectors in industry done according to a playbook that worked quite well for many years for tobacco, but is now failing. And it's really only when you get the chance to have the transparency of documents out in the public domain that you can see how it's actually done, and that then stops it. So the importance of transparency in the policy process it becomes critical. When I read an op-ed now in the newspaper about climate change not being important, the first thing I'll do is obviously try and find out who's paying for the article, who's the person writing the article. And these days, there are now ways in which you can find that information out, and it's usually not going to be a surprise where the source of the money comes from. There are going to be still some areas of scientific doubt, and there are going to be genuine scientists really making a case that there may be some complexities out there. But most of the time, whether it's, we've seen it recently on salt, we've seen it in many areas of the food sector where there are continued doubters about whether salt causes or has any harmful effect. I mentioned tobacco. We saw it in my own country about a virus causing HIV/AIDS for years. That wasn't for commercial reasons, that was for political reasons. So the ability to sow doubt and create that is something that is really hampers the development of sensible public health policy across the board.
I thought that one of the main themes that you brought forth in the play was the power of entertainment and convincing the public. The two doctors, you've both held positions where you needed to convince people. Have you ever considered using the power of entertainment?
Yeah, the CDC actually established a Hollywood office that was working to try and get different public health themes into shows. And I remember when ER had something related to, one of the programs I started at CDC was about appropriate antibiotic use. And they worked and they got a scene where it was still the George Clooney era, where he comes into the emergency room and there's all these people waiting to be seen. And he says, how many of you have a cough, a runny nose, sneezing? He says, well, you have a cold. You're not going to get an antibiotic. Go home. And we're like, yeah, we're all cheering at CDC. Whether it changed behavior, I think that getting health messages, correct health messages into popular media is really a great way to go. And I know in many parts of the world that's a very strong strategy to build them into the soap operas.
Do you think it'd work for obesity or global warming though?
I think you gotta get those messages, sneak them in whenever you can.
I mean, there's one of the best examples I know is Soul City in South Africa, which has run for over a decade, well over a decade. And it basically did what you were doing, really high quality entertainment, prime time television, exactly where you're going next, and with a real drama taking place in Soul City, which was a constructed shanty town, and the drama happens around a clinic. And a very carefully constructed permanent theme of HIV/AIDS, given that it was South Africa, and then recurring and new themes, whether it was on diet or tobacco or healthy food. Very high quality. The actors became known entities in the community. It gets repeated on 11 radio stations, 11 different languages, and then goes out as a broadsheet in different languages to all the schools with some of the learning messages. And in fact, clubs have been developed, Soul City Kiddies clubs have been developed where the themes are taken and elaborated further. Very complex issue, a way of doing it, but one that's been fairly carefully evaluated and seems to have moved the needle. I don't know whether they have tackled obesity directly, but they've certainly tackled things like healthy food directly, fruits and vegetables, popularized them. And the series on tobacco was carefully designed for when the legislation banning the sale of tobacco products to kids came out. And so the drama for those weeks was about the local townswoman starting a protest against the people selling tobacco to their kids. And they'd come with their pots and pans and storm them. And it was really a drama. What happened in a number of villages that people didn't realize that this was not a drama. They thought this was a news item they were watching. And similar protests started happening in those towns. And the result really has been, I say, quite a transformation in how tobacco is sold and advertised and marketed in the country. And I think that played a big role. I think also the use of puppetry has been incredibly useful worldwide. We've seen giant puppets used across Africa, often to take complex themes like HIV/AIDS and sexuality, which are difficult to deal with human actors, and it's difficult issues to address, which seem to have also had an effect. But I actually was, when I was watching Dr. Egerton, I was marveling at his ability and to get over a message that was so compelling. And obviously the extreme contrast that you were unable to really get it. It was just collapsing in emotion and technical jargon that sounded just so unconvincing compared to him. And that's where I think
Beat it to the end.
Just the very end.
But then think about this country. I think Richard sits in a critical position to be able to at least be a voice to amplify. But you know, luckily the last few years there have already been 2 surgeon generals in this country, Michelle Obama and Mayor Bloomberg. Very different types of surgeon generals. The official one has been on walkabout. But those 2 have really, in different ways, filled a really powerful position of being entertaining in some sense, being good communicators. Some maybe, Michelle being totally anti-polarizing, highest ratings out there. Bloomberg maybe has been a bit too polarized, but still it's been entertaining. And it's stimulated a debate, and many debates that have had dramatic public health impacts. And I think that's something we should be looking to more and more.
So one of the themes of the song there was modern cooking versus ancient ingredients, right? And I see that play a part in today's society with the resurgence of organic materials in people's diets. And you see how that, with the right marketing tools and money, has exploded. Recently, 6 months ago, I drank the Kool-Aid. I've gone full vegetarian, and this is coming from a person that likes his chicken meat so much. I might not see the effects till later in life, but I'm banking on seeing those effects. Recently, with the belt sizes, none of them have fit, so that's my recent impact. But later on in life, I hope to see something. I just want to get your sense of this. This past 6 years, the surgence of organic diets and ingredients, and how you guys have incorporated that into how you guys portray diets and your recommendations, and maybe your even personal diets.
Yeah, I think that there are 2 things that are intersecting. One is that a lot of people are very interested in what they put into their body, and I think that's a great thing. But I think that there is a marketing effort that doesn't match people's desire to really take care of themselves. We're being sold things constantly as better because they're either ancient or organic, and those terms very frequently have no meaning whatsoever. I've been reporting recently about a salmonella outbreak from chicken from these plants in California. Well, the chicken that comes out of that plant, you can buy it in some stores as organic, and some of it is in other stores as not organic, and it's all loaded with salmonella. But we've been conned in a way that when we see the word organic, that it is necessarily healthier for us, and that's not the case. It's the regulation hasn't caught up with our desire to improve. What people want is we want real food. We want to eat things that are good for us, that are healthy. But we don't have any way right now to look at a product apart from how it's being pushed at us to decide whether to do that. Challenge.
Yeah, I think if you go into Whole Foods, I think what is confusing is that you'll find that it's not really about healthfulness, healthy food in a classic definition. It confuses issues like local, organic, natural, the words wholesome are all over, sustainable. Well, none of those need to necessarily be healthy, and some of them, as you said, could either be particularly unhealthy, depending on how much you take in. I think some of the signals around simplifying the message make a difference. We're involved in an experiment in South Africa, a very large experiment, where the group I'm with discount healthy food by 25% in large retailers. And looking at what happened to consumers, they looked at 300,000 people over 2 years and saw that those on the discount showed dramatic changes in their diet in the direction towards more of a vegetarian diet, plant-based. Meat dropped quite significantly. We suspect down the line this is going to have an impact on health. The interesting thing about that diet, though, is that we then looked at what are the environmental consequences of the changes. And through some complicated ways, we're able to calculate the impact of changing that to a healthy diet on water use, land use, and greenhouse gases. And they also go in the right direction, making the point that a generally more healthy diet is also a more sustainable diet from an environmental point of view, bringing those two issues together. But the organic one remains a more complex issue. And some people will argue that organic farming is what we have as the predominant farming in Africa today. And that's why we're getting less than 1 ton per acre, and we've got food crises. Others would argue that unless we're going to address GM approaches, we're never going to reach the productivity and yields which have been declining over the last few years for the major crops, rice, corn, soy. So we're kind of in an interesting bind. I think part of it is going to be to educate consumers about what are the true long-term risks and how do you decide these risk-benefit issues. I think that's where companies like Monsanto really didn't do that very well, and now they're having to catch up, and most people are not going to believe the evidence.
I think we can take 2 more questions.
So first of all, I'm a professor of epidemiology at Columbia, and it's so nice to be at this play. It's so rare to see public health in the theater. So congratulations on a wonderful production. Just several points to pick up on here. With the translation of science to the public, and I thought that one of the brilliant things about this show was sort of the complexities, I think, of Egerton, and I think Dr. Yak, you picked up on this a bit earlier, that he translated information in a very compelling and interesting way, in a way that it meant that the town's doctor was virtually ineffective at getting her message across, but there was a way that they could have worked together, right? And so translating public health messages in a compelling way, in a kind of narrative that's not just solely entertainment, but couching public health messages and translating research to lay audiences in a compelling kind of narrative, I think is something that we ought to be doing more of, and that scientists ought to be doing more of, but we're notoriously bad at actually speaking to the media and translating what we find. And the second thing is that I think this play is so timely, since the House just passed the resolve to open the government again, and the salmonella outbreak, Dr. Besser, that you were talking about. I mean, this is arguably a result of not having oversight and the proper regulation in the wake of a government shutdown. And I think one of the aspects that this play sort of danced around, but not quite got to, was sort of the public health practitioner in the town was also the town physician, and there was no sort of outside regulation of public health that I think protected people from something like the flu. It was all upon this one woman to take care of that, and I think it underscores how much we need sort of a central government to put regulations in place to make sure that we have vaccines, to make sure that we have healthy food, to perform all of those public health functions.
You raised some terrific issues. The reason I went to ABC was to try and practice public health on television and do some of that translation. And I spent a lot of time back at CDC with my former colleagues trying to convince them that they need to learn how to be more like Egerton and less like Hill, so that they can tell a story, they can be compelling, and reach people in a way that speaks to them, that doesn't alienate them because they don't understand the words.
Yeah.
And at ABC we have 4 or 5 medical residents who work with us every month to try and, again, learn to speak English. You spend all this time in your medical training learning another language, and then your patients have no clue what you're saying to them. It's so important to be able to make that translation.
I think we can take one more question. In the second row, is it? Yeah.
I was just wondering, you obviously fused Ibsen's original story with the plot of the carnival roadshow kind of dynamic. And it seemed like that element of it takes it in a more public health discussion, whereas I would guess, I haven't read any of the people, but it sounds like that's more of like a psychological study on how a community reacts to sort of like a gadfly in their midst that is telling them things they don't want to hear. And I was wondering if that dynamic of sort of people responding negatively and pushing back against someone that's bringing a public health message is a concern within the public health community.
I guess quickly, as I'm a co-writer of the play, and I can tell you just as a little bit of backstory, you know, I've been looking at Enemy of the People for a long time in terms of thinking about how to adapt it. Our company, part of our thing is to have every show has a little bit of vaudeville or old, you know, some sort of nameable entertainment in it. We do sometimes it's puppetry or musicals or stage illusions, that sort of thing. And so there didn't seem to be an organic way to blend this, as you said, you know, Ibsen is known for psychological realism. There didn't seem to be an organic way to blend this story with our sort of kind of theater. And Khalid and I have been colleagues for a long time, and we were sitting around an office one day just brainstorming about how we were going to get to work together, and that in an early draft of the play, the thing that was going to be at stake was a Mardi Gras type celebration, and that the town, New Orleans, probably New Orleans was going to potentially shut down a Mardi Gras in summer, and it would have allowed us to do some sort of pageantry, and it would have been a very different kind of show, and that's kind of what I was wrestling with. And then, you know, a conversation with Khalid, and we started brainstorming about old-time vaudeville, and then medicine shows being a place where tap performers could kind of cut their teeth as they worked up to vaudeville. So that was kind of the way that this weird mashup, just a conversation between me and Khalid saying, how are we going to work together? Well, with that, I'm so grateful to all of you for sticking around, to our Dr. Besser and Dr. Yacht for sharing their time and expertise and wisdom, and the cast. So thank you so much.